Welcome to UCL's Lunch Hour Lectures, another session in a lecture series. I see some people have brought their lunch, that's great. I hope everybody brought their curiosity, because this is a sort of opportunity to learn more about a particular area of research. So my name is Andre Strijdom. I'm actually from King's College London. I'm a professor in intellectual disability psychiatry at the IUPPN, which is the Institute for Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience. But until very recently, I was based here in the division of psychiatry, and I still have a joint appointment between UCL and King's College London. So I chair the Lundowns Consortium, which is a consortium of research groups across London involving different institutions, different universities. We're all focused on trying to understand the cognitive aspects, so the learning difficulties of people with Down syndrome, as well as the association between Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease, about which you will hear more today. So this lecture has been organized to be closely linked with World Down Syndrome Day, which was last week on the 21st of March. It's every year on the 21st of March for a specific reason, 2103, because people with Down syndrome have 3 copies of chromosome 21 and therefore have 3 copies of all of the genes on chromosome 21. We will hear a bit more about that as well today. So it's my great pleasure to introduce 2 speakers today. I'll do them in sequence. There will be 2 talks. First of all, a talk by Hattie Cook, who is an advocate for people with Down syndrome, and that will be followed by a talk by Dr. Frances Wiseman. I'll introduce her more fully in a minute. But firstly, Hattie will be telling us about her own life and her experiences. I won't say more than that. Hattie will explain to you everything about herself. Thanks.
Okay, Mum. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Harriet Cook. I come from a big family. I've got 3 sisters and a brother. I'm an aunt to my nephew and niece. I do independent living in Red Hill, and I went to mainstream school first, then I went to special needs school. I do gardening at Red Hill, and I also do, I'm a local usher at my local cinema also up there. I also attended the Queen Elizabeth Foundation, where I learnt basic admin skills and other things. I do a gardening course in Wiseman. Okay, Mum, I won't. Try not to. My favourite job is working as an usher at the local cinema, where I get to see all the films for free. My favourite job is the usherette job, because I like working there. I get free teas and coffees. And least favourite job is working at the museum, which I found completely boring. I used to have paid jobs at the hotel down in Pearly Way. And that's it, really. I do an English class down in Wallington, which is not very far from where my parents live. Mum and Dad both handle my money and financial things. So when I go home on Monday, I always ask them for money. And where do you live? I do independent living in Red Hill, and I've been there for about 8 years. and it's a very nice place. We've got the library, the cinema, we've got the local shopping centre, we've got the gym, which I don't really go that much except for swimming. I have help with getting money out. I do a local gardening course down in Merton where I learn to pot plants on, sell them, and it's good there. It's run by WEA. I'm not sure what the initials mean though, so
Do you live on your own?
no, I do independent living, and I live with 3 other people who are physically disabled, which they can't get out. And I attend these talks whenever I can, when I'm not at work on a Tuesday. I've gone to a local drama group on Wednesday in Sutton, and they told me she's going to move to Croydon at the Fairfield Halls. I go to Rangers once a month, which Mum is the treasurer, and that's it. That's all I can think of. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Hattie. That was great.
Okay.
So Hattie will be available later on afterwards for questions as well, if you want to ask her some questions. So next up, it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Frances Wiseman, who's one of the scientists associated with the Lundowns Consortium. Dr. Wiseman completed her PhD at the University of Edinburgh more than 10 years ago now, I think. And since then, she's worked at UCL as part of a research group which she now leads, I think, that is focused on the early onset of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And she uses different models to understand the effect of the extra copy of chromosome 21 on the biology of the brain. Dr. Wiseman also holds an Alzheimer's Research Trust UK Senior Fellowship. And I know that, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this. No, okay. I'll stop there and pass on to Dr. Wiseman herself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andre. So thanks for that really great introduction. I'd actually just like to start with my thank you. And so my first thank you is to Hattie for setting the scene for today's talk. And it's really important for us that work on Down syndrome that we think about the people who've got Down syndrome and what they think about our work. So that's why it was really important for us to have Hattie come and talk today. So thank you very, very much. I also just want to thank, on behalf of the whole Lundowns Consortium, all the participants and their families, without which none of the clinical work in particular that Andre's team leads would be possible. And of course to thank all our funders who help us undertake our research. And lastly, I just want to wish everyone a belated happy World Down Syndrome Day for last week. So my name's Frances Wiseman, and as Andre said, I've been researching Down syndrome at UCL since 2007. In 2011, I joined the London Down Syndrome or Lundowns Consortium. So we're a diverse group of researchers, so basic scientists like me who work in the laboratory, but also clinicians like Andre and also psychologists and psychiatrists. And we're all interested in understanding and preventing development of dementia in people who have Down syndrome, which occurs as they get older. So I just wanted to start off with a little bit of background. So Down syndrome was first identified as a distinct cause of intellectual disability by Dr. John Langdon Down. And just as an aside, it happens to be that Dr. Down actually comes from exactly the same part of the country, southeast Cornwall, as I do. He grew up in a little town called Torpoint, and he was a grocer's son. And he moved to London to further his education and become a medical doctor. And he ended up becoming head of what was called an asylum in those days in Teddington in Surrey. And what Dr. Down noticed, that there was a subgroup of individuals within his institution who had a common pattern of facial features and cognitive strengths and weaknesses. And he wrote this report up in the medical literature, and that's the condition that we all now recognise as Down syndrome. So just to talk to you, in those Victorian times, no one knew what caused Down syndrome. And I'm just going to walk you through a bit of genetics because we now know that Down syndrome is a genetic disorder. So in all cells in our body, we have got a substance called DNA, which is our genetic code. So it's a chemical code which gives it our instruction manual for how all our parts of our body work. Now, in complex organisms like plants and animals, the DNA and the instructions are so complicated, they actually have to be sub-organised in structures called chromosomes. So in people have got 46 chromosomes. I mean, they come in pairs, and we inherit one half of the pair from our mum and one half from our dad. And I just want to draw everyone's attention to this little chromosome here in the bottom, chromosome 21, which is very, very important for Down syndrome, as Andre suggested earlier, because people with Down syndrome have got 3 copies of that chromosome instead of the typical 2 copies that we see in the general population. And this was first shown in the 1950s by some cell biologists and also doctors coming together and looking at the chromosome structures in cells isolated with people from Down syndrome compared to the typically developing population. And what Martha and her colleagues showed was that people with Down syndrome had 3 copies of 21 rather than the typical 2 copies. They had this trisomy chromosome 21. And that means that everyone who has Down syndrome has an extra copy of the 230 genes that are encoded on chromosome 21. And genes can be thought of as kind of biological functional units that each have a specific job to do in the body. So people with Down syndrome have got an extra copy of all those units. So I just wanted to talk about how many people have got Down syndrome now globally. So in the UK, about 1 in 1,000 babies that are born have Down syndrome, and that number is been very stable over the past 20 years despite changes in genetic testing. So this data is actually from a group in America, so it's American data, and what they've plotted is the number of people who've got Down syndrome by their age, and we can see we've still got loads of kids in the population who've got Down syndrome being born every year. We've also got a big group of people who are approaching middle age now, which is what the Lundown study is focused to think about. The WHO estimate there are actually 6 million people worldwide with Down syndrome, but no one actually knows because they've never been properly counted, so we don't know whether it's more or less than that number. And in the UK, we estimate we've got about 40,000 people who've got Down syndrome currently in the UK. So what we're interested in is what happens to people who have Down syndrome as they get older. So Andre's clinical team have been working to understand the onset and development of something called dementia in people with Down syndrome. And we unfortunately know from Andre's work and other people's work that 2/3 of people who have Down syndrome will have developed dementia by the age of 60. But this is very variable between individuals. Some people develop it earlier and some people much later. So what we want to understand is about why that happens. So for those of you who don't understand what dementia is what happens to changes to a function of our brain, and we most often think about these as changes that affect how we think and remember and how our ability to learn. But we also need to remember that also those changes that are associated with dementia can change how we feel. So associated with dementia, we can start to feel sad, anxious and worried about things, and all those changes to our memory and also how we feel are caused by a physical change, a physical disease in our brain. And the most common cause of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, and with people with Down syndrome, almost all dementia is caused by development of Alzheimer's disease. So we want to understand what it is that's causing dementia in people with Down syndrome, and we know that people with Down syndrome start to develop some pathology or changes in their brain as they age. And one of those changes is the accumulation of something called amyloid plaques, formed of a protein called A-beta, and that happens first. And as they get older, they also form accumulations of a protein called tau, which forms neurofibrillary tangles or tangles within their brain. And that these 2 changes then trigger the development of changes in function of brain cells, which lead to those dementia changes that we talked about earlier. So we know that people who've got Down syndrome have got those 3 copies of chromosome 21. We know that on chromosome 21 is a really important gene called APP, or amyloid precursor protein. And we know that people who've got Down syndrome have got 3 copies of that gene, that APP gene, and that they produce more amyloid precursor protein and the A beta that's produced from it, which is what accumulates in plaques within the brains of people who've got Down syndrome and also other people who develop Alzheimer's disease. And we think it's having those 3 copies of APP that's really, really important to developing the amyloid pathology. What's less well understood is how the amyloid pathology then triggers the formation of tangles and also then leads to changes in brain function and dementia. And actually, we don't really understand how that happens in people with Down syndrome, but we also don't really understand how that happens in the general population when they develop Alzheimer's disease. And our hope as basic scientists is that our work looking specifically at the needs of people with Down syndrome may also have broader implications for Alzheimer's disease development in the general population. By studying this special case, we might learn new things that are relevant to everyone. So we know that role of APP because there's some very special people who had Down syndrome but didn't develop dementia. So this is one report from the literature, which is actually quite a few years old. The clinician, V. Prasher and his colleagues, noticed that they had a lady who had Down syndrome in their clinic who was 78 years old and she had no dementia, and on imaging studies she had no evidence of any AD neuropathology. And when they looked at her genetics, they realised perhaps why that was happening was because her Down syndrome wasn't caused by a complete extra copy of chromosome 21, but only part of the chromosome was in 3 copies in that lady. And one of the genes that wasn't in 3 copies was the APP gene. So that lady only had 2 copies of APP. There's actually been several other reports similar to that. This was the first one that I'm aware of in the literature, which is saying that we know that having 3 copies of APP if you've got Down syndrome is central to that early risk of developing dementia. And those people who are lucky enough not to have 3 copies of APP but have Down syndrome haven't got any greater risk of dementia compared to anyone else. So what we're trying to do in the Lundown study is to understand why it is that we see this variability between individuals, why it is that some people with Down syndrome are developing dementia very early in their lives and some people in late. And this isn't my work, this is Andre Team's work and Roz's work, who are here at the front and will answer questions on it. So what they're doing is they're looking at people who've got Down syndrome, they're looking at their brain by imaging methods and also by doing functional studies that Roz understands much better than I do. She did just finish her PhD on that. And they're taking that data on how the brain works in people with Down syndrome and how it looks in people with Down syndrome, and they're combining that with how people with Down syndrome can undertake cognitive tasks. So these are special puzzles, and the one here, which is really difficult to do, is called the Tower of London. And what you've got to do is rearrange those beads in a certain pattern, and you have to try and do that as quickly as possible with the minimum number of moves as possible, and then Roz and all the clinical colleagues score you to see how quickly and how accurately you do the task. And they're combining all that data on how your brain works and how your brain looks with the genetics of the individuals to see whether differences in genes on chromosome 21 and the rest of the genome are actually influencing that risk of you developing dementia earlier or later in life. And the goal of that is to try and understand ways that people who are developing a dementia later, how we can think about how their brain's working differently, how their genes are working differently, in order to help the people who are developing dementia earlier to prevent and delay that onset of dementia. So what my own group do, because I'm a basic scientist, is I work with model systems. So I work with fruit flies, with cells grown in a dish, brain cells grown in a dish, and also sometimes with mouse models. And the reason we do that is because we can change the gene content in those model systems, those flies, those cells, and those mice, much more easily. So with people, we can't change their genes. We're all born with the genes we have. So we can start to manipulate the genes in those model systems to test the roles of specific genes and how they affect processes that are related to the development of Alzheimer's disease. So we can look to see which genes on chromosome 21 might influence the development of amyloid, the development of tau tangles, how those changes affect how brain cells work and how dementia and cognitive changes may occur in those model systems. Obviously, we can't look at cognitive changes in cells in a dish, which is why sometimes we have to work on animals, such as mice and flies. So our most recent piece of research was asking a really simple question, which was I was curious to know whether other genes on chromosome 21, other than APP, might actually influence the accumulation of amyloid within the brain. So what we did is we took an animal model which has an extra copy of genes on chromosome 21 but didn't have an extra copy of APP, And we bred that with an animal model that deposits A beta within the brain. And then we wanted to see whether having the extra copy of those 200 genes actually affected the amount of amyloid that accumulated in the brains of that mouse model. And what we found here was that we could see that we almost doubled the amount of amyloid that accumulated in the brain. And that was being caused by the extra copy of a gene on chromosome 21 other than APP. So we're finding there's a new gene on chromosome 21, which our results in the model system suggest might be increasing further the accumulation of amyloid within the brain. And we want to understand what that gene is next. And the reason we want to understand that is we want to identify that gene and understand the pathway, biological pathway by which it acts, and then use this information to develop new treatments to stop or slow that development of amyloid in the brain, both in people with Down syndrome, but also hopefully in the general population as well. So meanwhile, while we're doing all that work, Andre's doing his clinical work and our lab are beavering away trying to identify genes and targets and develop new drugs, there's some basic advice that we can give to people who've got Down syndrome, and it applies to the general population as well, about how that they can reduce personally their risk of developing dementia currently with what we know today. And the basic rule is what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So not smoking, keeping active and taking exercise, keeping your weight down, not letting yourself get overweight, making sure you eat a really healthy diet, not too much sugar, loads of fruit and veggies is really, really important. Not drinking too much alcohol, so not too much wine and beer, and also keeping your cholesterol and your blood pressure at healthy levels. And we know that people with Down syndrome tend to not have high blood pressure, but that's on an individual basis, so people should still go to their doctor and as they approach midlife and get their blood pressure checked and make sure that they're maintaining that. And if we do all those things, we can actually, as individuals today, reduce our risk of dementia, and that's something that is important to do. Now, the other thing we can do to think about preventing dementia is people who have Down syndrome can consider volunteering to undertake research, so either with Lundowns or with other research groups. And one thing that Andre's team is really interested in doing is getting ready to undertake a clinical treatment trial for AD prevention, so Alzheimer's disease prevention, either to stop the build-up of plaques and tangles within the brains of people or to stop that pathology being able to damage brain cells. And if you're interested in doing that, or becoming a volunteer if you have Down syndrome, please do contact the email address downsyndrome@kcl.ac.uk, and Ros, Sarah and Andre's team would be really happy to take your details and see if you'd like to participate in research, but that's entirely voluntary and you don't have to do it if you don't think it's the right thing for you. So it just remains for me to thank everyone for their attention coming today and their interest in Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome and dementia. And happy World Down Syndrome Day again. Thank you.
So there's some time for questions. Any questions? So just wait. So I should say, if you ask a question, just wait for the microphone first of all, so everybody can hear you.
So I just wondered, does dementia ever occur in people who don't have evidence of those protein tangles you described?
Oh, yeah, so there's other forms of dementia that can be caused by independent differences in the brain, so independent differences pathology. So one of the most common causes is Alzheimer's disease, but there are other forms where you just get the tau pathology, but no amyloid, and there are other rare forms that are caused by different proteins misfolding in the brain as well. So there's always some form of neuropathology as well as the dementia. Yeah. You can have cognitive changes in your brain which mimic dementia, so I know delirium and so forth, which aren't caused by those specific changes. But Andre, do you want to jump in with anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's right. Yeah. So there's different types of dementia. So genetic dementias that are caused by other genetic problems include frontotemporal type dementia, which is associated with buildup of another protein called tau, Lewy body dementia, which is associated with yet another protein. But then there's other causes of decline and dementia that is due to damage to the cells itself, the brain cells itself. So that would include vascular dementia, and that's when, For example, people suffer lots of mini strokes, small strokes, which causes some of the brain cells to die, and then people develop not Alzheimer's, but vascular dementia, another type of dementia on top of that.
Right.
But Alzheimer's disease, of course, is the most common form of
Yeah.
dementia. So I think that accounts for about 2/3 of all the dementia cases.
What is the life expectancy with someone with the condition? Because I personally have never really seen older people with Down syndrome. I tend to see them in young children or teens. Is there a reason for they tend to die younger? Or I've heard that they have heart issues as well.
So that was kind of not really the case anymore. So people with Down syndrome, about 40% of individuals with Down syndrome will be born with a congenital heart defect, but that's actually really screened for now and quite readily fixed with surgery. So actually, the life expectancy currently with someone with Down syndrome is in their 60s if they get good access to medical care, especially earlier in life, and have those early problems fixed, which can be done very readily. And I think, do you want to jump in about
I mean, it's an extraordinary success story, really. People with Down syndrome have tripled their life expectancy over the past 50, 60 years. So in the 1950s, a person with Down syndrome could expect to live into their 20s. But now the average life expectancy is around 60. So, so it's a huge improvement due to improved care, the surgery for heart problems, making sure that we monitor for other difficulties that people may develop. Also treatment of leukemia. Just children with Down syndrome are vulnerable to develop leukemia, so treatment of leukemia has helped too. And so now we see many people with Down syndrome actually reaching older age, which is a new thing, relatively speaking, as you mentioned.
You showed a slide and you were looking at I'm not sure if it was the birth rates of people with Down syndrome. Are people still opting to have children with Down syndrome? There was a time where I would imagine that wouldn't have been the case.
So the current evidence is that the incidence of live births hasn't actually changed in the majority of developed countries over the past 20 years. There are some notable exceptions, but it's still about 1 in 1,000. So yes, the answer is yes. Lots of people are choosing to carry on and have a baby with Down syndrome, and that's a personal decision. There's a myriad of different reasons. There's been a lot of data looking at that recently because of new genetic tests that have come out of the US and are now part of the NHS pathway as well. And we don't quite know what will happen with that, but current data certainly suggest, as far as I'm aware from looking at the literature, that it isn't going to change the incidence, the live birth incidence rate. So it's going to stay the same as it always has, to be honest.
So these newer tests are good in the sense that they're safer, much safer for the fetus. And so easier to do as well. And I guess what seems to be the case is that some people choose not to have the test, which of course is a choice. And other people decide that they will go through with the pregnancy and actually find that it's better to be prepared, I think. And so many people report that it helps to know in advance that they might have a child with Down syndrome.
Does it have anything to do with it? Does the condition have anything to do like diet, food, nutrition during pregnancy or prior to pregnancy? It's just one of those things. It's just one of those things that happen.
No, no, it has absolutely. There's no evidence that I'm aware of that the mother's kind of health status does not affect the risk. The only thing that affects the risk is the age of the mum. So if you, as you get older as a woman, your risk of any sort of trisomic conception, and it's not just for chromosome 21, it's all the chromosomes, increases, particularly over the age of 35. So, and I think anyone who's been through testing recently in the NHS will know that You know, when you go and get pregnant, they give you kind of these leaflets and explain your risk, and there's testing you can go and have. So yeah, so it's nothing to do with what you do during the pregnancy. It happens, you know, earlier on than that. When your egg's formed, basically.
So there's a few more questions at the back. First, that lady at the back, and then.
Hello. I read somewhere a while ago about the diet of children with Down syndrome can affect their intellectual development. Is there any evidence of that, and does that have any effect on dementia?
Yeah, that's a difficult question because we don't really know. I mean, of course, there's the general principle to live healthily, like Francis said, to look after your heart and your diet in general, and to manage some of the vascular risks is always going to be good, particularly if you get to older age when risk factors for vascular problems become an issue, including strokes and so on. But I'm guessing you're asking whether there's any sort of additional things that can be done, like taking vitamins or something like that, to improve cognitive outcomes. Is that right? Is that what you're asking? And I think that's really not clear. We don't know whether that might make a difference or whether that could make things worse. I mean, I think all we can do is to draw on the literature in the general population, which has shown that in general, supplements like vitamins does not seem to make a big difference to cognitive outcomes or even to general health, as long as you have a healthy diet and a healthy lifestyle. I think that's probably the best we can say at the moment. However, there are some research ongoing in trying to see if there are ways in which we can, give treatments or additional supplementation to improve outcomes for people with Down syndrome.
Hi. So I was just wondering, you said you were looking for a gene other than APP that might be involved in some of the development of a greater number of plaques. I was just wondering if there's any evidence for one gene in particular or a combination of genes.
Oh, excellent, really excellent question. So we have actually narrowed it down to a region of 37 genes, and we think there's probably multiple genes which are influencing the process from some other data that we've got in different model systems. And we're looking quite hard in that region at the moment. One of the genes in the region's already been suggested to be important for APP biology. It's called DYRK1A, it's a kinase, so we don't know if it is that one or not. Could be, we don't know. So we're working to try and look at those genes systematically now in FLY. So that's what we've got a PhD student starting that in September.
If I just ask a sort of supplementary question to that, in a sense, because I know you were saying that just having the trisomy, having an extra copy of the precursor gene led to more of the substance being produced. I mean, is it as simple that if you have 3 copies of a gene, you make, three times X of the precursor? If you have 2, you make 2. If you only had 1, you make 1. I mean, is it just an X? Because I don't know. I mean, it's a long time since I did any biology, and I'm probably a bit going a bit myself, but I thought I remember the sort of general idea was that having 2 chromosomes meant there were 2 sort of complementary copies of genes, so to speak, and one of them effectively coded proteins and the other one didn't. So that may be completely wrong, but is it just having, is it basically the number of genes you have determines the amount of the protein that's produced?
It depends on the gene. So some genes we call are dosage sensitive, so i.e. the number of copies of the genes affects how that gene affects a phenotype, including how much protein's produced. Some genes are dosage insensitive, and compensation within the genome, either by actually completely inactivating one of the 2 copies, as what I think you were talking about, can mean that having an extra copy has no effect whatsoever. And that's something that in the Down syndrome field we've been working on, to identify those genes that are sensitive to dose. Now for APP specifically, I didn't really go into this, we know that if you have 3 copies of APP in your genome and you don't have Down syndrome, you actually develop a form of familial Alzheimer's disease called duplication APP. So it's a duplication of just the APP gene. So we do know with quite a degree of certainty that APP happens to be a gene that's dosage sensitive,
Right.
and leads to the increase in protein and A beta production.
And do you know what factors the dosage sensitive genes have in common?
That's a really good question. Lots of clever people have been looking at that to try and understand whether it's to do with the promoter sequence, but there isn't actually a good consensus currently. We don't know. If we did, our jobs as research would be a great deal easier. So there's, lots of people actually, we don't, people forget about it, but lots of us actually have duplications of small regions of our genome called copy number variation. And some of those cause a phenotype. So some of them cause a disease or a change, and some of them completely don't. And so that's one thing that people in the Down syndrome field are trying to look at, that normal natural variation, and see what, how that affects biology as well. But no, we don't know yet. It's a really interesting area of research, so thanks for the question.
There's a question at the back.
So from your lecture, you seem to indicate that people with Down syndrome who have 3 copies of APP at some stage are definitely 100% going to develop this type of Alzheimer's.
So they're going to develop the Alzheimer's disease neuropathology in their brain.
Yes.
Whether they then go on to develop dementia is what's less clear currently. So we have to think about, we've got the disease, the Alzheimer's disease, which we see this pathology in the brain, and then that can trigger dementia. And as we were talking about earlier, there's lots of other things that can trigger the dementia. And we don't really have that much good data at the moment for the actual lifetime risk, because it's kind of been relatively recent, as Andre was saying earlier, for people with Down syndrome to get older. And what we need is longitudinal studies where we're following a big population of people for many, many years and looking at how many of those people who have Down syndrome develop dementia. And there's been one study in Ireland, but it's just been looking at women. It's quite a small study. And that is suggesting that by the age of 80, quite a lot of people will have developed dementia, but it's not looking at men at all, so we don't know about men. And also it's quite small. So I think that would be, any other comments on that, Andre?
And the other thing that we know is that there's lots of variability as well between people with Down syndrome. So some people may have early onset of dementia, and other people have much later onset of dementia. And again, that's very interesting. So we need to understand those kind of differences, because that could give us a clue as to what kind of treatments might be appropriate for Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome, but also perhaps in the general
The wider population. Yes, so is your aim then looking at things to prevent the deposit of amyloid and these NFT twists developing? Is that the aim for a treatment that's going to do that, or?
Yeah, that would be one strategy. So we think that that's quite a rational strategy to use in people with Down syndrome, more so than in perhaps the general population, because we know that there's a APP overdose, like Francis has explained, and it might be possible to target that overdose and thereby prevent problems later on. But there's still quite a few questions about that approach. We need to test that out and see if it will work. There are some drug candidates that we could use in clinical trials, but we're waiting to see if they are safe enough for a trial in people with Down syndrome. And if they are, we would definitely want to do a trial like that. The question then would also be when to give the treatment in order to prevent a problem that might only develop 10 years or 15 years later. So it's quite a few questions still that we need to solve.
And I just also to add to that, I think it's also to remember that there might be people, living today who've already got quite a lot of build-up of pathology in their brain, and we mustn't forget those individuals as well. And we need to think about treatments for those people who've already got the pathology. And that's also just was an AD conference, and that came loud and clear from the members of researchers, the families, that we mustn't forget. We can't just say, it's too difficult to try to do that. So that's something else really important to remember. That, so I think both strategies should be tried, in my opinion.
So I think there's time for one last question. There's a question at the back, right at the back.
Thank you. I don't know if it's a bit of a simple question. I was wondering, for the people with dementia, the people with Down syndrome who've developed dementia, have there been studies looking at whether or not they partake in so-called cognitive training apps or tools compared to those with those people with Down syndrome, dementia, who haven't? What I'm trying to get at is if there can be any kind of like reversibility or even a tiny, tiny bit of reduction.
So yes, yeah, that's an interesting idea, and I think that goes with the exercise idea, you know, the heart exercise, but maybe you can do brain exercises, isn't it, to make your brain fitter, as it were, to withstand the onslaught of any kind of pathology. I think that's an interesting idea, and it's definitely something worth pursuing. As you mentioned, there are cognitive stimulation programs that have been developed with that idea in mind. And so the idea is that through a cognitive stimulation program, you could improve what we call your cognitive reserve, in other words, your capacity to compensate for problems that might develop through pathology. And in doing so, if you increase your cognitive reserve, then it might take longer for the pathology to have a symptomatic effect. In other words, to present itself as a problem. I think that's certainly something worth pursuing, and I know that there are groups looking into that, trying to adapt some cognitive stimulation programs for people with Down syndrome and other people with learning difficulties. But again, it's things that we have to try out and test, and we would need to. The same question would be, when do you start it? How long do you give it for? And so on. But it's definitely something else that we can try and do. It'll have to be very brief because we will
Okay,
finish.
it is very brief. So
I
I know it's not the same, but is there kind of any correlation with autism and dementia?
I'm not aware of a correlation between autism and dementia, but we know that some people with Down syndrome do develop autism in addition to having learning difficulties. So about 15% of children with Down syndrome might have autism or autistic traits. And so there is some sort of relationship between those, between Down syndrome and autism as well, as there are with many other conditions that cause learning disability. It seems to be a common thing. Conditions that cause learning disability is also related often to autism at the genetic level and perhaps maybe at the behavioral level as well. But I don't think that would necessarily be related to problems that develop later in life. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this lunch hour lecture. I think it's a great program, it's a great idea, and that you have, and I'm very happy that you've shared with us our final event associated with World Down Syndrome Day. Thank you.